This one's called A Hidden History of Southern Stockton Bight. I'm sort of using that as a working title because I feel that much of the narrative and so-called history that's been imposed on the story of Stockton Bight has come from a sort of all-powerful centre from Sydney, and so it's a narrative imposed from above, which hasn't always been helpful in saving, say, southern Stockton Bight. I'll just read through some of it. For many years, our local community has proposed dedicating public land in southern Stockton Bight, with its iconic Sydney shipwreck located on Newcastle's doorstep, as a national park or nature reserve. For anyone that hasn't seen the more than 4,000 hectares of former Crown land beachfront, it's kind of like Lawrence of Arabia meets Fraser Island. There have been disputed accounts of what really happened to southern Stockton Bight, but what follows is an eyewitness account. My experiences as a local resident forms a microcosm of the ongoing corrosiveness of the mining industry in Australia against a fractured, weak green movement. It also illustrates how much of the accepted narrative imposed on our region comes from the metropolitan centre at the expense of the silent periphery, which has brought about a de-emphasis on the local landscape and natural ecologies throughout Australia. Here is a paper in the power. Now, between 1986 and 1996, I worked voluntarily in the local environment movement to try to stop sand mining in Stockton Bight, southern Stockton Bight in particular. And I was also involved in the push for a national park. It was at that time, this Crown land had formerly been called Newcastle Bight. It consisted of a frontal dune system, pine dunes and coastal heathland extending southeast from Williamtown to Port Stephens through eastern Fullerton Cove and Fern Bay up to Newcastle's northernmost suburb of Stockton. There had been previous attempts to save Stockton Bight, including initiatives from the Flora and Fauna Protection Society in 1968, the National Trust of Australia in 1972, and the National Parks Association of New South Wales in 1976. And I became involved when they started mining at the end of my street in Cox's Lane, Fullerton Cove. Before that, I hadn't really had any kind of activist or, environmentalist background. So in some ways I've come into it as an outsider. And it kind of just got dropped in my lap somehow. Southern Stockton Bight at that time, in the mid-80s, faced increasing pressure from extractive industries and residential development. Now the mining industry would call this sequential development, or all the corporate interests at the time would call it sequential development. This meant one company would first sand mine the forest of dunes to extract mineral sands such as rutile, zircon and titanium. Then another would quarry the denuded hinterland that was left over, levelling and carting away the sand to landfill or cement. The final step in the commercialisation of Stockton Bight was building houses on the now low-lying forested former sandhills. This bypassed the need for costly post-mining rehabilitation, such as recontouring and replanting the coastal forest, and effectively alienated public land for profit. Now, the public were never fully consulted about this endgame. Instead, we were being told that it would be fully restored. But when we go along to the regulatory authorities, such as Port Stephens Council or Department of Mines, or different departments that would have responsibility for different areas, although they were supposed to enforce compliance with mining conditions to force them to rehabilitate it, they simply weren't doing it properly. They would make half-hearted efforts of putting a few seedlings out and then forgetting about it on these denuded sandhills, they would not be irrigated or any attempt even to keep these seedlings alive. And as well, you have the problem of it being a monoculture, eucalyptus monoculture, rather than the diversity that had previously been there. Now, by telephone and writing throughout 1986, I complained to the New South Wales Department of Minerals and Energy, which was the regulatory authority for the RZN mines in Williamtown to Fulton Cove area. And there was a small section that they'd mined in the Highlands south of Labour's Lane. Naturalist Don McNair's, when I went to him and said, look, they don't seem to be cooperating very much, they don't even want to know. Can't understand why, for example, if you went to the police and said, look, they're robbing a bank, they might do something about it, but the guys that are supposed to be watching that, these government land wasn't being rent against their lease, wouldn't want to do anything. Now, naturalist Don McNair told me this was fairly typical. He explained that often mining companies would have a file on departmental officials containing a record of mistakes made earlier on in their careers, which could be used against them if they made decisions that were unfavourable for the miners. So they had a bit of a dirt file going. But that's just what I heard from Don McNair. I don't know. It would take a royal commission to actually verify whether that was the case. So getting nowhere with this department, I wrote as secretary of our local residents group to state members of parliament and the relevant minister. Eventually the minister got the department representatives to meet with the residents and environmentalists on site to discuss our concerns. Again, when I was organising the time and the place, it was quite an adversarial response. Well, you bring your experts and we'll bring ours. Whereas we were kind of hoping, if we get together, we'd have a collaborative approach, but that wasn't to be. Regional television stations such as Prime and the local media started to pick up on the story. So the coverage helped to bring wider community awareness in Newcastle and gradual support for protecting the area, getting more publicity for it. Because a lot of people in Newcastle just didn't seem to know about it. They didn't get out that way. They didn't get on the bus and just walk off the bus a few metres into the bush and find this wonderful natural, almost like Fraser Island, right there on their doorstep. So part of the problem was it wasn't well promoted. Our fledgling Newcastle Bight Nature Reserve group, we got started to try and promote the area and to lobby for it to be made into a national park. And we put out a little brochure at the time, which I'll go through at the end of this time. So part of our problem too was that none of us had any real networking, green group networking skills that would have been handy when we were dealing with major players in the green movement. First thing we tried to do was to get the head of the Newcastle branch of the Wilderness Society to publicly throw their support behind opposing sand mining in our area, but he told us that Stockton Bight wasn't a pristine wilderness anyway, so they wouldn't get involved. Later on they did, but that was only after a change of leadership. And when community concerns started to really snowball, then they jumped on board and started to make a real difference. But at the start, we lost many valuable years because we just didn't know how the whole green movement operated in terms of getting things on the agenda. And part of the problem was that the green agenda that was decided on by the New South Wales green movements, it was very difficult to know how it operated. Was it a consensus? But what it tended to be was things that were on top of the agenda were things that Sydney-based groups thought were important. And if you were in the green movement outside of the centre, then your environment, your agenda position tended to be lower down the scale. Another failure that we had, well, like one example was the way they worked very hard to stop sand mining in Kurnell in Sydney. And once that was, they beat off the sand miners there, they didn't go on and help our area from stopping sand mining. It just simply dropped off the agenda altogether. People celebrated that success of stopping sand mining in Sydney, but they didn't say, well, let's use all this momentum to draw attention to sand mining all over New South Wales, particularly Stockton Bight. That was a problem. There were a few environmental groups that started to pop up, and we naturally went to some of these other groups for support, like Eco Network, run by Darryl Dawson, or convened by Darryl Dawson. When we sent material along and about sand mining in our area, we were hoping to get, again, this to be on the agenda of Port Stephens, because it was a particularly pressing problem in Port Stephens, and particularly in southern Stockton Bight. Now, I don't know whether it was because this was a northern-based Port Stephens environmental group, but we couldn't get it on the agenda. From the inaugural meeting onwards, it was not, sand mining was not allowed on the agenda of the UK network. When I asked why, a question from the floor, it was simply that, we're not here to fight capitalism, and that was that. A lot of the time, I just didn't get it, and someone took me aside and said, is the former head of the Communist Party in the Newcastle area, one of the leaders of the Communist Party in Newcastle, and I thought, okay, that's why, something about capitalism or something, but anyway, so we weren't very successful in that part, in that area. But later, Darryl Dawson ran as a candidate in local elections on the platform of saying that he would stop the developers and stop Bruce Mackenzie Macca, who had a lot of sand mining interests and was also on the council. However, sorry?
He's got more now.
Oh yeah, he's now a big sand mine czar. He didn't contest Mackenzie's seat. He didn't contest Bruce Mackenzie's seat, but instead ran against Councillor Brian Watson-Will, the only councillor with a perfect green voting track record, and succeeded in placing him on Port Stephens Council. So anyway, at times it seems like we were competing amongst ourselves, not really on the same page in terms of directing our actions in the most efficient way. And I don't know whether it was personalities or what was going on, but part of the environment seemed to come second a lot of the time. Around 1990, a small sandpit, believed to be expired and owned by Hawkins Sand at the end of Cox's Lane, was taken over by Bora Resources and began rapidly expanding without development consent. A public reserve, PR 170039, designated for environmental protection, and a World War II military heritage radar station and gun emplacement adjacent Boral's quarry, was unlawfully bulldozed and levelled to the ground. I'll just see if I can show you this picture. Okay, so this photograph here was taken just the lagoons around Williamtown, just east of Williamtown. I've got a photo of, just to show you here where the Cigna was, the Cigna shipwreck. It also included that area. When I went to scan the Cigna, it's actually, the software was crashing on me. So I had to do the next best thing on one nearby. these are the kind of Sahara-like dunes that you see. A lot of film crews like to shoot their sort of desert dramas at Stockton Bight. This is Boral Quarry when they were just starting to eat into the forested pine dunes. Unfortunately, the quality is probably not quite enough to show you the ocean. It's just along here. So there was the mobile dune, the ocean front, then the mobile dunes, and then after that you had forested pine dunes. Now behind that, towards Fullerton Cove, near where I lived, you had Boral resources, bulldozing and carting away the sand and going straight into not even mineral sand mined land, but actually going straight into almost virgin forest, well, pretty much virgin forest, and all without what we believe was a current or development consent, and without any submitting any conditions or for public comment. So naturally we tried to go to the council and get them to do something about it, get them to submit it. This, by the way, is Public Reserve 170039. It was the only reserve in the entire area that was zoned for environmental protection as a reserve, and that was bulldozed by Boral Resources. Now, the Newcastle Herald wouldn't print that. I think they were worried about being sued. However, I had film footage of bulldozers and big double trucks being loaded while it was all happening, the public reserve being mined away, scooped up in bulldozers, and it was on 16mm film. Now, when eventually with the help of, because we were getting nowhere with council, and eventually someone put me on to Doug Lidgo's organisation, the Northern Parks and Playgrounds movement, and with Doug's help we were able to get an ombudsman's investigation. Also with the help of the Environmental Defenders Office, I think sent a letter to try and get the Ombudsman's Office, because at first they wouldn't do anything because they said, well, we rang council, and they said, no, you're wrong. So that was as far as it went until, more higher status people got involved. It wasn't enough for just a resident to say, oh, look, they're doing all this, and they said, oh, council says it's just your word against them. But anyway, when they had the ombudsman I spoke to, and she said, well, what evidence have you got? We got out, we had to get the film out onto an editing table, magnifying glass, and got through, and what she was trying to find was whether there was enough definition to show that the license plates of the mining vehicles, and because there wasn't enough definition to show the license plates, we weren't able to prove that it was Boral, because we couldn't then go to the registration and say, yes, they own the truck. So, but I did have enough evidence that they couldn't really sue me for saying that, because I think the balance of evidence was definitely that they carted it away, was right next to their quarry, and one of their managers admitted to me that, well, we needed better access anyway. So they ended up giving a lot of this sand away to Fullerton Cove neighbours to try and get them on side, but not telling them that they were intruding into the public reserve. So that made them complicit in the same problem and less likely to, say anything against it. So that was another way that they tended to isolate people in the community that spoke out against it. Eventually, though, even though we couldn't prove that they'd done it, the Ombudsman Office did suggest to the council that they call for be asked to put in a development application, and that there be a investigation, public inquiry into what had happened. But it was really hard getting and an EIS, yeah, to get development consent. That was part of the Ombudsman's orders, and that they had an adverse finding against Lord Stevens Council on their record keeping. But it was very hard to get submissions for anyone for this public inquiry. We couldn't get, Eco Network wouldn't come on board to testify that it was an important area and that it was in danger of being bulldozed. In fact, we had to go as far afield as Maitland with Friends of the Earth group, and Jan Davis was played an invaluable role in helping us at this inquiry. But again, we could never understand why the Port Stephens environmental group that claimed to be the umbrella group for all of Port Stephens, why they wouldn't help us. And again, it's some sort of internal politics that was beyond us. But somehow the environment was all the worse for the way agendas were working and the way you set agendas. Now, when they had the public inquiry, the Justice Kevin Cleland in 1996, he ruled that that Boral shouldn't be allowed to mine the high conservation value forested hills, and he identified areas that should be saved and not allowed to be mined. So the council had paid $20,000 or more, I think it was 22, for this public inquiry. Then, because Boral went to them and said that it would be uneconomic not to mine the forested high dunes and the high conservation value areas, so guess what? They had a vote and voted to give everything that Boral wanted, to let the guy ahead mine it. And then, you know, there wasn't even one dissenting vote. That, you know, so it was quite a sad day when Councillor Watson Will, who had a perfect green voting track record, got voted off the council because the head of Eco Network competed against him in the local election. You know, so it meant that we had no dissenting vote on the council, and it was very hard for me to go along and say, oh, something's wrong with this.
Were you saying that Councillor Dawson,
yeah.
Councillor Dawson voted for the destruction of the whole area?
Councillor Darryl Dawson voted that they ignore that Commissioner's requirement, but recommendation. But when he was asked why, you know, according to the Hyde family, why didn't he put in a dissenting vote? He said, well, everybody else was voting for it, so I thought I should too. And then there's sorry, like Newcastle. Yeah, look, I've only gotten to about 2/3 of the way. I was going to talk about the federal election, what that was like, but I've run out of time, have I? Yeah. But that'll do for
But I think that's a really interesting account of radicalisation, isn't it? That, you know, you're just an ordinary person living in the street and they start sand mining at the end of it, and you've been drawn into all of this activity and this whole world. But it also shows the diversity and disparity amongst groups which might be labelled radical, and how radical is not monolithic by any stretch of the imagination, and there are competing agendas and so on. So let's turn it over for questions and comments.
Two brief comments. In this book that's eventually going to come out, I think that it's good that there's going to be stories in there about victories that were won, and there's going to be stories about defeats, and I think we should have both. those types of stories in this book, because I mean lessons can be learned from both, and we need to remember the victories as well as and the defeats. The other thing is, someone made a comment earlier about bodies on the line. Bernadette didn't mention the fact that she actually received threats by telephone. She had things put in her letterbox.
They graffitied my house too with bringing out, you know, and I got death threats.
And the local graffiti, the local area around,
Yeah, all around the
Stockton and all the rest of it.
Yeah, it was pretty full on.
Yeah.
And to me, it just underlines that point that being a radical, whatever that exactly means that you do have to be brave. You know, and that's why most people don't want to know. That's why Bernadette said she didn't exactly know how this landed in her lap or whatever. But the thing is, most people, when they're seeing injustice or something going wrong, they'll just duck for cover. But thank God we've got people like Bernadette and others who are prepared to take the risk.
Very much.
Had time to go into the federal election, but did the hostility arise from your courageous stand to stand for the federal election?
The attacks on my house and the death threats happened about within less than a year of the federal election, and a year, I think within about 2 years of me standing for the election, and then when I contested BHP's proposal to mine Southern Stockton Bight, and it was going to be the Surfriders Foundation that was going to contest, you know, appeal against BHP's approval. But my colleague Wilkinson, who was going to sign the appeal documents, didn't turn up in time, or it didn't turn up by the deadline, and I had to sign as the appellant. So it became Bernadette Smith versus BHP et al., which was Todd Stevens Council, BHP Minerals, and the Department of Urban Planning, Affairs and Planning. We had been appealing to the Department of Urban Affairs and Planning to, to step in to help us. They ended up stepping in on the side of BHP. So that was the ER. And yet, you know, in the Sydney Morning Herald in 2008, it got reported that it was the Carroll Bissett Ridgeway and I think Surfriders Kathy Rich that had fought to stop the sand mining against BHP, and that their campaign was successful and that it was handed over to Aboriginal ownership. But actually the Surfriders Foundation had never been campaigning for the land transfer. We were only supposed to be campaigning to save it from sand mining, and it's had the opposite effect, because since it got handed over to Aboriginal ownership, it's now been sand mining more than ever. They've promised the biggest sand mining in the Southern Hemisphere.